Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to welcome back Dr. Scott Goldman. Scott, great to have you back on the show.
Oh my God, it's such an honor and a privilege. I think at some point I might become a co-host. I don't know what number this is, but I'll tell you, I'm so grateful that you keep inviting me back. I love our conversations.
I think this makes you, it's your fourth time, so you are the most invited guest. So, yeah, I must like you, mate. You must
Oh,
add some serious value to the show.
I can't wait till my four timers jacket, or I don't know what it is that you get for being a four timer, but I'm looking forward to getting that in the mail, the four timer ring or trophy. This is awesome.
Yeah. I'd like to say it's a big check, but it's probably just it's a beer whenever I make it out to Ann Arbor. Probably that's it.
Perfect. A beer it is. I'll take it.
So look, it's very much season's greetings, and we're here at the end of the year. We're here at another, I suppose one could describe, tumultuous year, 2021, to accompany the tumultuous 2020. How's your year been, mate? To summarise things.
If I were to put it in one word, I would say it's a whirlwind.
Okay.
You know, it's funny, right? Or maybe it's not funny. We thought 2020. I mean, I feel like 2021 was really just 2020 part two. It seems like certain things won't go away, and there's a lot of people out there that are struggling right now. And so, just to have some perspective, I'm looking for when the brighter day starts to begin, and hopefully that's 2022.
Hopefully, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Although with a new virus coming along, that might be a little bit of time. But look, let's cast that aside for the time being. Let's remind our audience who you actually are, mate. I mean, I'm sure they know. Who doesn't know? But give us your potted biography.
Yeah, potted biography is I am a licensed clinical psychologist and sports psychologist by training and trade. I started at the University of Arizona, where I was one of the first embedded psychologists in an athletic department. I helped co-author the best practices for the NCAA. I was part of their first mental health task force. Then went to the University of Michigan for 4 years, where I led their performance psychology team for their athletic department. And then I was the sports psychologist for the Miami Dolphins, an NFL team, as well as the Detroit Lions, the Washington Wizards, and I currently work for the Golden State Warriors as their sports psychologist. While all of that was my day job, I had a side hobby where I developed a test called the AIQ, which measures sports specific intelligence that is across all five major leagues in the United States, as well as places in Australia, the Netherlands, Ireland, a few other countries are using it as well.
Remind us, because I know we did a whole episode of the AIQ, but I love it. I think it's fascinating. And in my day-to-day consultancy, I'm constantly observing players and considering the internal that's driving the external, and the cognitive factors that might be rate limiters, might limit their capacity to be able to scan and act on what they're seeing. So tell me a little bit about the AIQ. Give us some background.
Yeah, so first of all, I appreciate the opportunity. I love talking about it. My partner, Jim Bowman, and we met at the Albert Ellis Institute. He was a fellow and I was a staff member. And we just started talking about, everybody's trying to measure these athletes. Are they big? Are they strong? Are they fast? How do they get the job done? And so we said, well, what about between the space? Like, what about between the ears? What about the headspace? And not from an emotional perspective, but really from a cognitive processing perspective. How do they think? So, we started with what's the simplest definition of sport? And we said the simplest definition of sports, it's an ever evolving puzzle in a chaotic situation. And then we said, okay, now what are the cognitive abilities to help navigate that? So we spent about 15 years researching what are the cognitive abilities for unsolvable, ever evolving situations. So we looked at firefighters, police officers, special forces, airline pilots, all of that. But we also spent the majority of our time looking at sports. And so we came up with a profile based off the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of intelligence and put it into play about 2012. We now have a pretty large database of elite caliber athletes across all sports. And we've published two white papers, one based off of statistically significant correlation between AIQ and the NFL and on-field performance, and another second white paper, statistically significant correlation between the AIQ and Major League Baseball. And we're about to submit a third one here in about a week or two regarding NBA. To my knowledge, we are the only instrument out there that has statistically significant correlation and has been published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. Humble brag.
What specifically does it measure?
Yeah, so it measures things like visual spatial processing, reaction time, learning efficiency. So, again, if you were to say, okay, how do we define intelligence? Intelligence is our ability to acquire, process, and apply information. So, what we're really looking at with these elite athletes is how do they do what they do? How are they in the right place at the right time? And some people do it with height, some people do it with speed, but some people do it with knowledge, right? And how they go about digesting that knowledge. So the primary focus when we first developed the AIQ was for it to really be a development tool. I've never met a coach that loves to mother F players. I've never met a player who loves to be mother F'd. But that happens, that frustration happens because the teaching mechanism. So we tapped into that school psychology degree that I had, and my partner Jim, he's also got a school psychology degree. And we said, could we come up with more efficient methods of teaching? What ended up kind of evolving from that was we also discovered that we could find more efficient ways for positional placement. So, for example, one of the European football, not American football, European football teams that use us, we were talking about a player who was positioned as a 9, but the spatial awareness category, which is really knowing where you are in relation to space, suggested that he might drift. So I asked the player and the coach, do you get pulled off sides a lot? And they're like, how did you know that? And I was like, well, I didn't, because I'm just a dumb American. I don't know European football to such a high level, but I said, your AIQ profile shows that you could get kind of like lost in space. And so what was interesting was I said, are you fast? And he was like, oh yeah, I'm really fast. I said, well, have you all ever thought about migrating you from the 9, that point position, and maybe pushing you over to a winger position where you'll have some distance between you and the last defender, therefore less likely to get lost in space and pulled off sides, but could make up for that distance with your speed? And they were like, yes, we've actually had that discussion. So I think the AIQ in the development phase has been really helpful in amplifying signals and eliminating noise and giving people good confirmation about elements of sport that they're trying to solve. Like, would this person be a better 9? Should we keep him at the 9, or should we pull him over to being a winger? But what I find a lot of teams also use this for is the onboarding, right? So pre-talent selection. So there becomes that element too.
So teams in America, NFL, NBA, they're actually basing their recruitment, their decision making as to who they bring into their organization, in part on the information that they acquire from your test.
Yeah, and just as a point of clarity, like it's never a go, no go kind of thing. It's never an opt in or opt out kind of description. It's more about would this person be a good fit for what we need from him? So a good example of that would be there was a wide receiver who in college, a wide receiver in American football, who in college only ran 3 routes. And so the coaching staff were just enamored with his physical attributes. Man, he was big, he was strong, he was fast. And they said, wait till we bring him into our offense where we're going to have these super complicated multiple option routes. And the AIQ suggested he might struggle with that. So the team had to make a decision. Do they go with a less physically talented wide receiver, but could handle the rigors of a really complicated offense, which is what their team was based off of? Or do they scrap their offense of philosophy, simplify it, and play to this person's physical strengths?
It's fascinating, because I interviewed Dr. Gaia Jordet on the podcast, who's a Norwegian sports psychologist, Scott, and he is regarded as one of the leading researchers on visual scanning. He's done just incredible work in that area, and this feels like something that is almost the invisible mediators underpinning that visual scanning, that we can actually assess where somebody is looking through modern technology. We can actually see that, but we can't necessarily see the kind of cognitive processes that you're talking about. The ability to sort through the information that they're seeing, that players are seeing, and then their capacity to act quickly on the information and probably act accurately on that information. So it feels like this test, the AIQ, provides coaches with what they've probably perceived for, I don't know, 100 years to be actually unknowable, and then affords them the opportunity to make coaching decisions based on this information.
Yeah. First of all, I have a little bit of a man crush on his research. I mean, I think he's done some brilliant work, and the way he's been able to kind of summarize those to some really strong applications. So, I'm hoping at some point our paths cross. I would love to pick his brain. And I agree with you. I think some of his research and some of our research really complements, because as you think about the mechanism, right? Um, First of all, there's the, like, let's just kind of walk through the biology for a sec, right? Like, the eyeball has to bring in information and then send it to the brain, and then the brain's got to kind of process it and send it to different parts like the frontal lobe. And not to get super nerdy or technical, let's just think about what happens of where that circuitry can get disrupted. For example, if you don't have very good vision, that already is going to be a hiccup, in the fidelity of the process. Then you could have some significant learning disabilities or even a brain injury that could then interfere with that. Then you could also have some emotional hiccups like anxiety or something else that can kind of jar that process. So what I love about people like you and Gare and all these other folks is like, um, to really understand what's going on, even in the simplest of human behavior mechanisms, it's unbelievably complicated and sophisticated. I actually have a question for you, if we can kind of make this a dialogue. I mean, I appreciate the interview and all of that, but I love our dialogues. I'm curious, how do you manage, or how do you consider the complexity of it? Because I think one of the things that's kind of happening right now is there's a lot of excitement about mental health, performance psychology. There's a lot of dialogue. And yet at the same time, I'm not so sure the dialogue is having a level of sophistication or complexity that matches what it is we're really doing. So what are your thoughts on the complexity dilemma, as I like to call
Yeah, and I think in simple tones, stripping things back as best one can, negotiating with the athlete in terms of how they can strip things back to be able to help them to, going into a game, for example, focus solely, or at least as best they can, only on the responsibilities in their role, their performance actions, and perhaps a mental framework that envelopes those performance actions and envelopes the responsibilities in their role, and linking those together. What's my job on the pitch? What's my job on the court? It's to execute the responsibilities and my actions in my high performance mindset. That's something that I'm getting athletes to consider and think about all the time. But I just wonder if we help them strip things back linguistically, we help them strip things back process wise. That's stripping away the noise. I think is vital, and I think it's interesting what you're saying. I'd love to get your reaction to that, or response to that. But it's interesting. Before Christmas, we had somebody on, Dr. Oliver Runswick from King's College London, and he does a lot of work in the area of anticipation. And his work demonstrates that there's context influences anticipation, which you've just alluded to, which is what a player knows and is thinking about in the lead up to a game. If that player is distracted, if that player has problems off the pitch or the off the court or the course, if that player doesn't like the opposition that they're playing against because they've had bad experiences with them before, it influences their ability to anticipate and make quick decisions. So context matters. Context can increase complexity, and so stripping back that complexity by helping athletes to focus on what they can control, specific information, controllable information, or as close to controllable as possible, positive information, things that we focus on, not on things that we don't want to happen, but things we do want to happen, I think is a good start. Having a mental skills framework is a good start that we envelope around actions and responsibilities. I think once we get players in that position there, and they know what they've got to do from that perspective, it gives them a better chance to strip away the noise and go and execute and have the very best performance they could possibly have. I don't know if my ramble answers anything there, but it'd be interesting to get your response.
Honestly, what I would recommend is anyone who's listening to this, they just hit rewind 30 seconds and listen to it again, because I think there was nuggets of depth and goodness. And that's a big bite. I think what you just delivered was a big bite, and that will take a while to chew and digest, right? Which kind of, I don't think it was too much. In fact, I think this becomes part of the question or the underlying context of it, which is, I find you have this brilliant brain. You are having these unbelievably sophisticated conversations with some of the leaders and best in the industry, and you're digesting their concepts. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think this podcast at some point should get you another diploma or degree, and I'm not sure what we would title it, but I think you've earned it. But my question kind of goes back to this simple point, which is, one of the secrets is taking all this really complicated stuff, converting it into a place that's easy for someone whose primary focus is sport related, so that it's digestible and understandable to them. Like, I think you kind of remind me of that metaphor of the duck that looks super still above the water and yet is just kicking its feet like crazy underneath. How do you take such sophisticated information and put it into a digestible bite so that the player is not short circuited by so much information out on the pitch, but able to go, okay, this is what Dan told me to do?
I actually think it's quite simple, in as much as, and I don't think I have a great brain, I just think I'm a bit of an anorak when it comes to sports and performance psychology. But I'll answer that by giving you a working example. One of a player in a global sport that I work with happened to have a very big game not long ago. A very big game. One would argue it was the biggest game in the world for its sport. And that player had a very simple objective. And it was wrapped up in a couple of sentences or a few sentences. My job on the pitch is to be relentless and dominant. I'm going to be relentless and dominant non-stop. Relentless and dominant non-stop. Every run, every movement, every action, I'm going to be relentless and dominant. Every performance action, I'm going to be relentless and dominant. I'm going to be relentless and dominant in my responsibilities. Nothing and no one takes me away from relentless and dominant. I know exactly what a great performance looks like. I can't force that great performance. I can't force it. But what I can do is stick to my game face of relentless and dominant. And that means a game face of relentless and dominant for every action and every responsibility. I don't care who we're playing against. I don't care how many people are watching. There happens to be a billion people watching, but I don't care. I'm going to be relentless and dominant. I don't care if my cross goes into row Z. I don't care if I miss a chance to. I'm going to give away the sport here, but I don't care if I miss a chance to score. I don't care if we go a goal down. I don't care what happens. My job is to stay relentless and dominant with every performance action and every performance responsibility, and that's my number one task. And if I can walk off that pitch at the end of that game and say I achieved that, I've done my number one job. That doesn't mean I'll be 100% satisfied necessarily, because there are probably going to be some performance things that I have to work on afterwards, and that's fine. But I've done the thing that is specific, controllable, and positive. I've executed how I want to. That, to me, I think you've got to strip it back, strip competitive play back into a manageable narrative with a mental framework that envelopes actions and responsibilities, the game model, the principles of play. And that gives players the best opportunity to high perform or have their best possible performance. And that word possible is so important because it's got to be nuanced. It's got to be a sophisticated relationship with performance. And I think globally, this is where we go wrong with competitiveness. You got me started here, Scott. This is where we go wrong with performance because I think that as human beings, how we function, we can't guarantee performance. And I think what we've done, what we've socialized ourselves into over the last 100 years of competitive sport is all or nothing thinking. Now, you will appreciate this because you were trained by Albert Ellis himself, right? All or nothing thinking. There's no shades of grey. There's extreme language around competitiveness. I don't think that's a sophisticated relationship with performance. And I think we have to be more nuanced around performance, maybe more tolerant on ourselves around performance and tougher on ourselves around mindset. But mindset linked to performance. So I'm kind of answering your question in terms of how I might strip it back. I just recognize that what I'm saying feels quite complex or quite layered, but it is stripped back because ultimately that player is just going onto the pitch saying, all my job is is to go and execute actions and responsibilities, relentless and dominant. That's all I can ask for myself. Now, okay, there will be some other stuff there. Of course there will. He is going to assess the game as it unfolds, as information emerges and dissolves, right? And that's where the AIQ will be useful underpinning all of this. But that's maybe how I would answer that.
But I think something that you point out is that you're a sophisticate. And I think that there's something to be proud about that, right? Because we do live in a world where anyone can be an advice giver. And wisdom can also come from anyone. Like I love that Ratatouille quote. Like my kids are a little bit older now, but yeah, I still am a sucker for those Pixar movies. And when he says, "Look, like you know, not everyone can cook, but a cook can come from anywhere." And I think there's some truth to that, but there's also this flip side to that, which is I think there's a lot of people who love to be advice givers. You go get your haircut, you're often getting advice. You go to a bar and order a drink, there's also an opportunity to receive advice, and even from friends and family. And I think what's really interesting is a lot of the high performers that you and I interact with are inundated with advice. They get in an Uber car, they're recognized, and it's, "Hey, coach," or "Hey, player. First of all, it's an honor to have you in my car." The fandom. And then they go, "Hey, how come you didn't go for it on fourth down? How come you didn't?" And so I think what you just highlighted is yes, anyone can be an advice giver, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their advice is of substance. And so I think something that you're kind of highlighting with your statements that I'm really resonating or vibing on is like I appreciate that advice can come from anywhere. The question is, if I am a receiver of that, do I take everything and accept everything? Do I reject everything? Or how do I select? And I think it becomes part of it is okay, maybe we need to kind of assess um, is it the piece of advice that I should be evaluating, or is it the messenger that I should be also taking into consideration a little bit.
So several things to say there. I love the direction this is taking because, and a couple of things. What's going through my head at the moment is you being the dad who forces his kids to watch Pixar now rather than the other way around. Um,
Wait a minute, I gotta jump in real quick before you get into that. I can just defend myself. I still watch the Pixar movies. They've all moved on, and yet I'm the one. So they'll walk into the living room and they're like, "Dad, you're watching Ratatouille again," and I'm like, "I am. You want to join me?" And they're like, "Nah, I'm good." So I'm the one that's still digesting because those things are beautifully written. What an amazing company!
they're upstairs busy blowing up a bunch of soldiers in Call of Duty or something like that, yeah, and you're downstairs watching a French chef rat or whatever it is. Yeah. So and remind me to come back to, and I think some good mental skills, stroke sophisticated relationship with competitiveness and performance was the US Open tennis final this past year. So we'll come back to that. I love what you were saying there, and what it was making me think of was actually my conversation with Dr. Jamie Taylor from a few weeks ago, and we were talking a lot about metacognitive skills. So as we know, posh term for thinking about your thinking or thinking about how you learn. And his stance was very much we need to be better in our talent development pathways at helping players be better learners. Not just, we want them to be better at learning, but actually being more critical in terms of where they're accessing the information and how the information that's coming at them and how they're dealing with that information, and potentially what we're not doing well enough. In our talent pathways, we talk about effective and efficacious activities in our training sessions. We want to help players get physically strong. Maybe in some talent pathways they're starting to introduce mental skills. Brilliant. But are we helping players be critical thinkers about the game, their game, and the voices around them, and their own voice as well? That for me is somewhere where that's quite an exciting, tough to be able to develop, but that's quite an exciting avenue to start thinking about because I just don't think it exists that much.
So, gosh, you got my brain spinning. I love it. And so I don't know if this takes us on a slightly different turn, but this is something you've stimulated. Um, Refresh my memory. Who was the author? I believe you had her on that wrote 7.5 Lessons from the Brain.
Yeah, so Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Yeah, so let's give her first of all a shout out for her brilliant work and awesome ability to digest some pretty sophisticated stuff in a way that a guy like me could understand. So I really appreciate that. But one of the things I took away from her book was, like the brain is always predicting, right? She talked about how the brain is always predicting. And I don't know if you're following some of this, but there is a relatively new kind of thing that's happening right now, which is like what's old is new again, which is a lot of neurology and
Mm-hmm.
neurological training has gone back to being very philosophical. And I've heard different
Mm-hmm.
titles. Like one of them that I think is kind of sticking right now is this neurophilosophy. People are starting to just sort of think about thinking and really how sophisticated the brain is. And so I came across a professor, I'm blanking on his name. I feel bad about that. But he was talking about how all behavior is fated, that there's this new kind of philosophy, neurophilosophy, that says all of our behavior is fated. And so I'm going, okay, so let's put these two ideas together, right? Like, okay, the brain is always predicting and all behavior is fated. And I believe he expands on the all behavior is fated because what he's saying is, um, all of the things that we're exposed to, all of the stuff that we're digesting and absorbing and everything else, which is also what was said about the brain is always predicting, is it's predicting based off of historical digestion. So this idea
Mm-hmm.
here is like we don't have free will. That was the argument, that we don't have free will
Yep.
because we are already comprised of everything that has brought us to this moment in time. And I have found for me, and just as a personal disclosure, I've had people who go, you know, when you're talking to a team, giving a presentation, or just talking to someone individually, me on one on one, they go, you just pull things out of you, like research or past experiences or empirically validated strategies or tech. They go, you just keep pulling these, like, where do these things come from? And I'll be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know where they come from. I'm really honored and humbled that they resonate with the people that I'm dialoguing to. But I don't know where they come from. But it does make me start to think about maybe this sort of like faded philosophical concept of I'm just supposed to be here at this time to deliver this message in just this way for this person, and that this is all preordained because of the history of things that I have been exposed to and experienced. I wish I could, and again, just in kind of like a vulnerable state of disclosure, I wish I could tell you it was purposeful. I just, I just try to listen deeply to people. And when they say something that I think taps into somewhere in my memory banks that resonates, I try to share that knowledge or pay it forward. What's funny is I have no clue when that happens. I really don't. And I've had people who have come to me and said, gosh, you said this thing that really stuck with me, or you said this thing that really had impact in my life. And I'm always grateful to have shared that moment with them. But more often than not, I'm like, I don't remember what I said, or I don't like. I wish I could repeat it, or I wish I could induce it. I find it to be almost a found discoverable.
Well, I'd like to quiz you on the predictive brain, because this is something. I mean, if 2021 has meant anything for me from a sports psychology perspective, I mean, Lisa Feldman Barrett's work has heavily impacted my thoughts and my work and my reading list as well. And for neuroscientists who shape the world around us are Jeffrey Hinton, Chris Frith, Carl Friston, Andy Clark, and I've been reading some of their books, and it's all, predictive brain is associated with machine learning. So things like Netflix will go and visit Carl Friston at UCL, University College London, to talk about the predictive brain, because it's all about inference. Basically, the brain is sense data and you alluded to this earlier, when sense data hits our retina, the brain is making a best guess of that sense data. As Lisa Feldman Barrett says, the brain is just in a box, basically, and it's hypothesizing the sensory input, both from the external world, which is called exteroception, and internal world, which is called interoception. However, if I was to break all that science nonsense down, I would translate this in part, and I'd love to get this, given all the experiences you've had with all the teams that you've worked at, but especially at the professional level. One thing I've noticed when I've worked in medical departments, the conversations players are having with themselves Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, going into a weekend game, really do matter, because they're loading their predictions. Predictions are changing all the time. So, for example, and this is a statement I make often on Twitter, Liverpool, so Liverpool Football Club, soccer, Liverpool are Liverpool, not just because Liverpool have great players, but also because the opposition perceives them to be Liverpool. So that influences, probably in a negative way, their ability to then go and face Liverpool, because they're saying, it's Liverpool, we're going to Anfield, Jurgen Klopp, Mo Salah, Mane, Trent, and players are having this conversation Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in the lead up to this game. It's creating memories, it's creating predictions that then unfurl themselves on game day and taps into anxiety and worry and doubt. So the conversation, the predictive brain, for me, is so interesting a phenomenon, because it's, and we'll come back to this work of Dr. Oliver Runswick here, is that it's actually shaping context. Have you found in your work that the conversations players are having with themselves and with others, Monday through Friday, going into a weekend game, can really influence, tap into neuroticism, anxiety, etc., or am I just making this up here?
No, I definitely think you're onto something. And you asked me to kind of pull from some of my experiences in the professional space. Like, I'm comfortable sharing this, though I do want to be cautious and
Of
respectful.
course, yeah.
Um, you know, when I worked with the Detroit Lions, which is a program that has historically struggled. It's one of four teams to have never gone to the Super Bowl in the NFL, and it also happens to be one of the original NFL teams. So that's a really difficult feat to accomplish. And so, Coach Patricia, the head coach that I worked with at the time, he and I would dialogue a lot about how to break through that glass ceiling. That sometimes there is this like residue in the building of like, are we doomed? Are we cursed? Like there almost becomes that kind of vibe. And so we would talk a lot
Yeah.
about that. And honestly, I think we were on to some solutions, but unfortunately, our process got disrupted by by ownership wanting to do a change. And of course, like look, the one constant in sports is change and all that. We just ran out of runway. But it was interesting to talk about that glass ceiling. The thing that I noticed from a behavioral observation was when we had the lead, the team, the players would start to look at the clock.
Hmm.
It was like, you would just see on our sidelines how many people were looking up at the scoreboard and watching that clock run. And so, the old cliche about like playing not to lose rather than playing to win.
Yeah.
Now, by contrast, the Golden State Warriors, which right now is a active dynasty. I mean, they are a basketball dynasty. They've won a ton over the last couple of years, and I mean, phenomenal talent, phenomenal coaching, phenomenal players. But there is this amazing belief state. Like, I was attending a game this last week, and it was one of these things where everybody just sort of felt like, of course, the ball's going to go in the hoop. Like, no shot was going to. And it's not by superstition or dumb. Like, again, both organizations are working incredibly hard. Both organizations are getting themselves prepared for the game and everything that you just described. But they're tapping into a historical database, both personal and organizational wide, and kind of coming to two very different conclusions. And I'm really fascinated by that digestion. I mean, to oversimplify it, winning begets winning, and losing begets losing. And to disrupt those flows are pretty challenging.
I love how you described it, residue in the building. Can that residue be cleansed, essentially? I mean, there were some interesting things you've said there. With the Golden State Warriors, that notion of social identity. Who are we? Well, we win. That's what we do here. So it's interesting, isn't it? There's that juxtaposition between two big global organizations, both of whom, as you said, are working really, really hard. But one seems possibly to strip it back and make it very simple. One has that social identity of, well, what do we do here? We win. We win games, and even if they lose, well, what do we do here? We win here. That's what we high perform. That's that's if the walls could talk. That's what they would reflect back at you. Is that changeable? Is that shiftable? Can sports psychology contribute to that? If so, how?
Yeah. So yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, and yes. Right. So let's look at the Boston Red Sox. They had the curse of the Bambino. They ended up winning eventually. You've got the Chicago Cubs. They had the curse of the goat. They ended up winning eventually. Like, I think one of the things that I'm kind of resonating on right now, and I don't know if this is truth, I'm just saying perception, my perception. Like, take a look at Coach Kerr. He won a lot in Chicago. He won a lot in San Antonio. And so I think there is a historical experience of, I know what it's like to be in that moment and be in that situation. So now let's go back to the Detroit Lions. They have Coach Patricia, who is also part of a dynasty. The coach had been in the New England Patriots system for 16 years before migrating to Detroit. So he had also experienced winning and knew how to win. And so I think what was interesting, and I don't think he gets enough credit, was he was trying to instill not the Patriot way, which is what people sometimes accused him of, but he was trying to say, like, hey, there's a standard that comes with excellence. Like, it's not just so much about like looking at the scoreboard, hoping the clock's going to run out versus a team that could be down by 20 points and says, don't worry, we've got this. It's also the idea of to your point, from day one, from the second we start planning for the match or the game, what are we doing that helps us contribute to winning versus what are we doing that might help us contribute to losing? So where does sports psychology kind of sit in that space? I think it's about recognizing when a wobble starts to occur. How do we kind of get the train back on track? I think it's also about sometimes inhibiting a desire. So, going back to our talents and our gifts, sometimes we can derail a system. All we have to do is plant the wrong seed at the wrong time, even with good intentions. So sometimes it's the things we don't say that can have great impact too. Um, or it's the idea of like, you don't want to say something to a coach at a time where they all of a sudden get locked in on that idea, perseverate on that idea, and then they let go of their game planning. Like, so it's really being respectful of the process, being supportive
Mm.
of the process, and and I think the one thing that I'm finding to be more challenging than historical 10, 15, 20 years ago is giving a team a long enough runway. Because um, when the faucet stops, to get the faucet to turn on again is really really hard. And when the faucet's turned on and flowing, that maintenance is a different kind of energy or output. So again, what I'm observing with the Golden State Warriors, that
Mm.
faucet's flowing. Those players are unbelievably gifted. They work as hard and have amazing character. Walking around that building, the talent is beyond just what they can do with a basketball. The talent is about their character and the
Mm.
human beings that they are and their quest for excellence. Like, it is unparalleled. Then you go back to, like, say, the Detroit Lions, where I think that was being installed
Mhm.
slowly, and unfortunately, they weren't given the time to let it really blossom. So seeds got planted, and so again, wanting to be
Yeah, yeah.
cautious and careful here, I think one of the things to be mindful about is if you don't give an organization or the people within the organization enough time, if you're constantly rerouting the garden, so to speak, um, seeds will never
Mm.
really germinate.
Time.
Yeah, here, yeah, time is undefeated, right? But let's switch gears for a second. I came across a study that I've been dying to share with you,
Mm.
Dan. I want to hear your thoughts on this. So, first of all, I'm going to give a shout out to a dear friend and colleague, Hap Davis, who is a brilliant neuroscientist and really did unbelievably impactful and important work with refugees, did a lot of post traumatic stress disorder treatment for refugees, and happened to somehow migrate over to NHL and Canadian Olympic sports. Probably because, as he used to put it, post traumatic stress disorder with a capital T, like a refugee fleeing a country, and post traumatic stress disorder with a lowercase t, like, say, missing a game winning shot, have some shared biological, neurological components. So the guy is brilliant. He came across, so he did this study, and I want to make sure I capture this well. They wanted to see what high performers would look like in a default state. So what they did was is they created a scenario where they took Olympic high performers and they put them in an MRI machine. And for those that don't know an MRI machine, it's kind of like a way to take a movie. It was an fMRI, not MRI, sorry, fMRI machine. And so what they did was is they put them in this tube. And for those that don't know, what it captures is not a picture of the brain, but really like a moving picture, a movie of the brain. So you tell someone who's in the tube to think of a donkey, and sure enough, a part of their brain lights up, and we make the assumption that's the area of the
Mhm.
brain that's associated with the memory of donkeys. So here's what they did, and I just think it was so brilliant. So they told these Olympic high performers, like, hey, we're going to get you to kind of watch your performances, and we're going to see how your fMRI reacts, right? But then what they did was they said, hey, the machine's not working right now. We just need you to kind of sit there in sort of a
Yeah.
default state. Just kind of hang out for a bit. But the machine wasn't
Okay.
broken. The machine was actually capturing data. So I give this to you. Do you want to know what happened when they were in their default state, or do you want to guess what happened in their default
Just
state?
give it to me, man.
We're not building any suspense or tension. Hit them with the hind. Okay, here's what they discovered.
Mhm.
When high performers are in a default state, the neuronal activity looked like the precursors for depression. So I asked Hap Davis, why is this?
Yep.
Is sport create depression? Are they under recovered? Is it a genetic predisposition towards highly creative individuals like Kurt Cobain and Jimi Hendrix or Van Gogh? Like, we see this tie-in, right, between emotional unrest and highly creative, ingenious individuals. So why is it that high performing athletes, when sitting in a default state, would illustrate neuronal activity that is a precursor to depression? That's my question to you.
Because you're constantly stressed about performance. Because 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 of the uncertain environment you're confronted with every single day. That dissonance between what you want and probably what you're not getting a lot of the time.
So I asked Hap Davis, I go, this is remarkable. This is remarkable. So I asked Hap Davis, I was like, all right, man, like you've got me on this discovery. Can you give me the answer to the test? Why do elite
Mm.
high performing athletes in a default state have a profile that looks like the precursors to depression? And Hap Davis, one of the most brilliant people I know, you know what his answer was? I don't know. I was like, oh my God. Why? And to me, this goes back to the complexity of sports psychology. Why is it high performers? Because remember, it's not everybody. Not everybody in a default state has this precursor for depression. It was only the high performers. So, and it becomes chicken and the egg. And so here's why I bring it up. I think the work that you do, I think the work that I do, I think it's really complicated. I think it's really complicated. It's really sophisticated. I think we have to sometimes recognize what's the difference between high performers and people who are not in a high performing environment, and also what's the same, because some things are universal. Like we do all have our moments of sadness, our moments of anxiety and doubt and pain. What can be sources of those emotional discomforts is is not necessarily universal. So, again, missing a game-winning touchdown or missing a game-winning three-pointer versus, say, not performing well in a corporate meeting or corporate setting. Like, there's similarities there, but there's also differences. So I think
Yep.
one thing to note is just to be have a high level of training in emotional aspects, behavioral science, psychology, is great. I think that's a good foundation. To have an understanding of what it is in high performance space is a whole nother level of education and training requirement. And then to take it to one step further, which is sometimes it's not about going towards the negative, it's also the idea of optimization and going towards the positive, which is like, what does it take to create a dynasty? Or what does it take to win a championship? Like, to really understand it and to be like on the sidelines like you have or I have, is to appreciate how unbelievably complicated and challenging, and I'll use the word fragile.
Yeah.
I think there's about a thousand things that can happen during the course of a season, and all you need is one of them to be disrupted in order for the outcome to be failure.
So I've got a bit to say on this,
Please.
and I want to throw back a proposal, a hypothesis as to why the neuroscientist might be seeing what he's seeing. It's just a hypothesis. And then a question for you. So that hypothesis, I suppose, is linked to what I've said already, but for me, the environment most adults work in is their performance moments come thick and fast. You've mentioned the difference between the workplace and the sporting environment, and we're talking about the elite sporting environment here. So in the workplace, you could categorize, and I would imagine people might categorize if they really think about it, their performance moments as the meeting they've got to facilitate, the presentation they've got to give, the sales pitch they've got to do, a phone call to make, a conversation with a difficult colleague. One could argue that people have 15 to 20 performance moments during a day. And so they're in many respects, they're constantly performing, which is why, again, one could argue why mental health and well-being is such a big piece these days. How do people retain a sense of well-being and mental health in the workplace when these performance moments are coming thick and fast? However, for an athlete by and large, and every sport is slightly different, if we remove the notion, which I think it's fair to remove, if we remove the notion that, let's say, practice isn't a performance moment, video analysis isn't a performance moment, your performance moments don't come thick and fast, by and large. I mean, is it baseball? Well, they'll probably play more games than anybody else, okay? But still, it's not 15, 20 times a day. It's several times a week. And there's just something about that environment where you don't have the relief of experiencing and completing that performance moment, where you're constantly in limbo. You're constantly got performance moments coming up. That's stressful. And I wonder if that plays a part. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
So here's my response to the thought of your first statement. Sometimes I'll show the teams that I'm working with, I'll show them a particularly advanced stunt scene. There's this great one from the Transformers where they are squirrels zipper suiting through the buildings, or I show this one amazing one from Iron Man. I think it's Iron Man 3, where Iron Man connects. It was at the time the largest connected free fall of a bunch of people. And so I show them these amazing things, which the athletes react to, like, oh my God, I could never do that. Now, and then I break down to them some stories and quotes from both movie sets where they talked about the countless number of hours. And I think it was it Craxton who made this quote, the famous performer, who said, like, you don't practice till you get it right. You practice till you can't get it wrong. And so, like, it's this notion of mastery, right? And so I try to pull into it that the details matter and kind of highlight what you just said, which is all of these moments. Like, if a coach calls you out in a film session and you feel some discomfort there, that is a moment that you will always
Yep.
remember. So again, the brain is always predicting and all behavior is fated. This is a historical moment that will then help you feel and digest the next moment differently.
And I love what you're saying, and it's food for thought. My second one is actually more a question around, if, let's say, we lived in a world where we put every player in an fMRI and there was absolute consistency across athletic populations in terms of that brain scan, in terms of what you said, do we intervene? Do we intervene? Because these are the brains of high performers. These are the brains that light up the stadium. Do we intervene? Because if they're constantly stressed, is that ethically where we want them to be? Do we intervene? Would we deteriorate performance if we do? Or is it a case of, I've had a few guests on our podcast, Lawrence Halstead, who's written a book, Kath Bishop, who's written a book about this, and they're former Olympians talking about that notion of a more sophisticated relationship with competitiveness, that actually this all or nothing approach, we need well-being and mental health strategies. We need a better relationship with performance, and we won't depreciate performance. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I've got a couple of stories, and so sit back and relax, Dan, because I'm about to get on a soapbox. And please interrupt me at any time if it becomes pretty boring or germane. My first response to this is always the same. There is no uniformity. If there was, we would have figured it out by now.
Yep.
So I think there are certain things that we have to respect and appreciate. The stock market is unpredictable, gambling is unpredictable, and sports is unpredictable. There is no, if there was uniformity, we would all just go, hey, let's all just replicate Tom Brady's brain kind of thing.
Yep.
So, so the premise that you put out there is like, if there was uniformity, do we hold on to it? Do we reinforce it? Do we leave it alone? But let's go back to the second part of that premise, because I'm going to say, hey, there's no uniformity. But the second part of that premise is the notion of, if someone is performing at a high level and is suffering, do we leave them alone and let them continue to suffer in exchange for that high performance output? That's how I digested your question. And that's a pretty sophisticated question. I was working with an unbelievably talented individual. I won't say which sport and I won't say which space I was in when it happened. But this
Mm.
individual had come to the conclusion that their father made a cataclysmic decision in their life, the athlete's life, that had to do with an important surgery where, if they had done the surgery in a more conservative approach, it would have ended the person's career, the player's career. But if they did this sort of more risky surgery, this newer method, it could preserve the player's career, but it could risk death. And the way the player tells the story, and I'll be honest with you, the pieces don't totally add up to me, but it's always about their perception. The way this player described the moment of the decision to be made, the player was not included in the decision. And so the dad made the sole decision. And the dad decides to take the riskier surgery in order for the player to be able to continue to pursue their sport. The player comes to me after struggling and struggling in a national championship game, and kind of shares this story about the surgery and everything. And the player says, every time I talk about this surgery, I cry. And in the nature of some of the dialogue that we're discussing, a big part of the player's relationship to sport was about connecting to other people. That it wasn't really a love for the sport, it was about a dire need for approval and acceptance from others, and sport provided that for the player. That was the driver. Now, this to me exemplifies the moment you just described. What do you do when you see, like, to use an REBT terminology, like an irrational belief or an unhealthy belief,
Yep.
but seems to be contributing to a lot of success? So in this moment, I was a fairly young professional. I called the American Psychological Association because I'm a member.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you're given access to is free consult. So I sought out consultation, which is what I think ethical psychologists should do. And the person I was talking to said, well, you have to be crazy to participate in sport. Like, the number of hours and commitment and dedication and everything you do, of course, these athletes are all going to be crazy. And in that moment, I realized the distinction between being just a psychologist and being a sports psychologist. And just to go on a slight tangent here, I would differentiate this, because what I'm saying is sports psychology is not psychology working with a different population. Sports psychology is understanding a sophisticated specialization.
Mm-hmm.
And the person I was consulting with clearly didn't get it. So I sought a second consult, this time another brilliant person who is on my speed dial. His name is Patrick Bailey. The reason why I have such a tremendous amount of respect for Patrick Bailey is He has a PhD in psychology as well as a JD in law. And he had been working with teams like the Calgary Flames and all of that kind of like, so he'd been in the professional space, but he had this great understanding of
Mm.
ethics. So I asked him, what do I do? And he introduced me to the Canadian Code of Ethics, which is the exact, like the content of the Canadian Code of Ethics and the American Psychological Code of Ethics. Like they cover all the same stuff, like, be a good dude,
Yeah.
basically. The one difference is the Canadian code is hierarchical. And I bring this up because the first principle that the Canadian code talks about is respecting the dignity of the individual. And the way Patrick explained this to me, which I will always hold, is he said, if you were a cardiologist and you were working with an obese patient,
Mm-hmm.
and you told them that diet is important and, for their heart and their heart health, they need to like eat right and all that. After having a really impactful session, this cardiologist is walking by a cheesecake factory and sees the same patient that they just warned about their heart and their heart condition eating a big slice of cheesecake. Would the cardiologist walk into that building and knock the fork out of the person's hand? Now, bringing it back to sports psychology, I think there are some people who will kind of be that sort of motivational guru, sort of like, I'm going to get right in that dude's face and tell him to toughen up or, give him some hard love. And so they might knock the fork out of that cardiology patient's hand. What Patrick explained to me in the notion of respecting the dignity of the patient is that the cardiologist in the story did his best or her best to educate the patient so the patient can make a
Yeah.
well-informed decision. And
Yeah.
once that moment was completed, he had or she had to respect the patient's dignity to choose.
Yes.
So I took all of this, I went back to the player, and I said, our last discussion has shown me that one of the things that's driving you is also causing some pain. Now, I think we can switch drivers, but it might take some time. And there's also some uncertainty there. How would you like to proceed? And the player's answer was, I'm going to keep everything intact. My misery is mine, and I'm using it to help perform. But what I'd like to do is come back to you when my career ends. And I was like, first of all, very profound. The athlete was a young athlete, very profound. So first thing I said was, wow, what a sophisticated answer. Second thing is I said, this athlete's never coming back. I was like, that's it, it's over. And sure enough, 3 years later, athlete calls up, hey, I'm ready to start working. I'm ready to start talking about this. My career's over, and let's discuss. And the work from that moment on was really profound. So that's my soapbox. I'm stepping off, Dan.
Well, mate, that's such a fascinating story, and I think that is actually a wonderful place to finish things today. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. I know a lot of sports psychologists and a lot of young sports psychologists listen into this, and that would be a story that they can ponder and consider and think about their practice. But I also know that obviously thousands of coaches, sports scientists, competitors, and so on and so forth, administrators tune in, and it gives them an idea of the challenge and the complexity that in the psychological side of sport delivers every single day. So thank you for that. That was really interesting, Scott. It's just another brilliant conversation, and I could go on for another few hours with this, but I'm conscious of your time, and I also like to keep things nice and succinct, and give us the opportunity to have a fifth episode.
Yes, I'm saying if there's a five timers club, I want in. Let's do it.
That's a beer and dinner, I think, at some point in 2022 if I ever make it over there. Listen, mate, thank you so much. And I know that everything we've discussed, you will have tapped the interest of the audience. And I know you're now a keen tweeter. So how can people follow you on social media, and how can they get in contact if they so desire, especially around something like the AIQ?
Sure. I always appreciate the opportunity. It's funny you say keen. I have no idea what I'm doing in the social media space. I do have accounts, but I don't know how to follow them or what to do there. What I would say is if someone wants to get a hold of me, it's relatively easy. They can go to our website, which is athleticintel.com, and just hit the contact sheet, and that'll come to me. Or they can just email me directly, which is my last name, Goldman at athleticintel.com.
Scott, a very Merry Christmas to you and a Happy New Year, mate. Thank you so much.
Hey, season's greetings, and let's bring on 2022. It's only going to be good from here. Let's do this.
Fingers crossed. Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.